Our next speaker, Michel Lee, is an attorney, and she is a senior policy analyst with Promoting Health and Sustainable Energy. The acronym is PHASE, P-H-A-S-E. And she is also chair of the Council on Intelligent Energy and Conservation Policy, the acronym CIECP. Michel has presented, is Michel here?
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Thank you. I didn't know if you, I thought maybe you weren't there for a second. Okay, thank you, Michel. Okay, and Michel has presented before the United States Department of Homeland Security and the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board panel of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and served as public observer at an emergency response drill for Indian Point. And Michel was also in the Soviet Union 4 years after the Chernobyl disaster. Michel?
Hi, thanks so much, Catherine.
You're welcome.
To host, okay, I'm getting, well, whatever. I want to get rid of me, go to Valerie View. So just one point on Chernobyl, since that was mentioned last, which relates to Fukushima. Fukushima was a coastal reactor. And because winds called the westerlies, 80% of the radioactivity blew out into the Pacific Ocean. So that is what saved the nation of Japan. We may have a whole very long-term public health issue with seafood, but the fatalities and other, the extremity of the disaster was really an accident of geography. Chernobyl was an internal plant. It was in the middle of the country in Ukraine, in the breadbasket of Ukraine, and over 1,000 square miles are still uninhabitable and will be deemed uninhabitable for the remainder of this century and possibly very well into the next and the next, okay? So that is really the scale that we're talking about when you have a disaster. And the fact that the nuclear industry understands this is evidenced by the fact that it will not self-insure, that in the wisdom of Congress in the 1950s, when nuclear was in its infancy, came up with something called the Price-Anderson Act, which puts the vast amount of the liability and the cost of dealing with an accident on us, the shelters of the taxpayers of America. So that was 1957, because insurance companies, the independent arbiters of risk, who don't have any, horses in the race, wasn't going to go near nuclear. Fast forward over half a century, the insurance industry still won't take nuclear. I think that says a lot. And the nuclear industry itself will not self-insure. So I think that's all you need to know about the actual assessment of safety issues. What about waste? Waste generated by nuclear power. Same thing. Decades ago, the Congress, God bless them, decided that the American taxpayer, through the Department of Energy, would be responsible for the permanent disposal of high-level nuclear waste. Fast forward decades and decades and on, here we are. We're still responsible financially, and there's no permanent disposal site, but they're trying to create an interim site that may end up being there for permanently, but even the license, the Holtec, which is trying to get a license for the site in New Mexico, acknowledges, maybe a century or so, but, what the heck, right? And of course, they want the Department of Energy money to pay. So that I think sort of deals with all we need to know really about safety and waste from a point of view of what the real cost benefit calculations are on behalf of the industry themselves. Because, hey, we're environmentalists, what do we know? I want to pull back a little, because I'm hoping at least that the people on this call or all, individuals for the most part, even the ones from the nuclear industry who may be watching, really want to create a sustainable planet, and we're all in this together. We're all in this together. And if the COVID crisis isn't showing that, honestly, I don't know what is. And what we have to do really is pull back and say, what kind of world do we want? What kind of world do we want? What kind of world now that's sort of being wiped away do we want to create? And we want to create jobs. The people in the nuclear industry are highly skilled. They're qualified to do so many different things. They're pipe fitters, they're electricians, they're chemists, they're physicists. The intellectual power and the skill and the dedication of the actual online nuclear workers is waiting to be harnessed, just as much as the actual energy from the sun and the wind and the waves and the tides and geothermal and all the other potential renewables are waiting to be harnessed. So you really have to think of why aren't they? Because it's not about what workers want. And by the way, I don't think too many coal workers would be really upset about coming out of mines to work on solar power, putting up panels, or using their skill sets to they're used to going, into difficult spaces as those nuclear workers. They're used to taking risks. You don't think they'd be very, very happy if there was funding, if there was public support, if there was policy support behind them, to get out of the areas where there's radioactivity and they have to have Geiger counters, or where they get black lung disease? You don't think that they would be on board with that? So it's not the workers. What we're talking about, honestly, and let's acknowledge this, and this is a bipartisan issue that's gone on, virtually my entire lifetime, which is slightly getting long at this point. Let me just point out one thing that's really important. A lot of people in the environmental area tend to be a little siloed, just like every other field, right? Where the anti-nuclear group and the anti-pipeline groups and the anti-fossil and the climate change, and everybody sort of comes together for climate march, but then everybody goes back to their little, nonprofits and works on their very narrow focused issue. But all of these things are absolutely intricately tied together. And one of the ways that they're tied together is actually in the industry itself. Because the idea that nuclear power and fossil fuel, particularly natural gas, are not joined at the hip is actually false. It's the same industry. In the United, that's true globally, but particularly in the United States. Every single nuclear operator in the United States operates natural gas plants. Now, some of them are getting rid of the coal plants because coal is having, as everybody probably knows, dying off. But no, the nuclear operators are they're all the parent corporations, right? How does this work? You have parent corporations that then spawn off dozens and dozens and dozens of subsidiaries, most of which are limited liability corporations, which is very cute because then when a liability corporation can't pay, then they just go bankrupt and the parent corporation trots merrily along. Let me just read something from a presentation by Exelon, one of the Exelon executives by the name of William A. von Hoene Jr. This was given to the United States Energy Association annual membership meeting in 2014. I'm going to quote. In some regions of the country, subsidies like the PTC and state renewable mandates push wholesale energy prices even lower by oversaturating the market with wind. For example, in Illinois, wind is, quote, artificially suppressing energy prices. And he goes on to say, we know Exelon has been held out by many as anti-wind, when we're really anti-subsidy. We as an industry can't continue to deny that subsidies for generation distort energy prices. And then there's a quote also I have from the UBS. We see the combination of state-by-state renewable mandates and energy efficiency initiatives as inevitably leading to a supply-demand imbalance that will put further pressure on baseload coal and nuclear retirements. So what does this tell you? That the industry is really behind what they invested in, right? And unless they're going to be given incentives to get out of it, they're going to keep investing in it, right? Because it's not because they're evil, it's because that's how the entire financial system and Wall Street and corporate law works in America. So this is 2014. Exelon's decrying the idea of subsidies because, oh, how horrible, that's going to distort energy markets. La-di-da-di-da-di-da, fast forward, and it's 2015, 2016. And what does Exelon do, the same corporation? It jumps into a large-scale renewable intervenor proceeding and in New York, and helps change New York. What was rolled out in 2015 as a big, grand-scale, large-scale renewable energy program for changing the marketplace in New York State to subsidize and promote renewables. No, it ended up being a massive bailout for Exelon, which acquired plants from Entergy, which is the operator of Indian Point. And they ended up getting a $7.6 billion subsidy. So another little interesting fact coming across, U.S. Congressional Research Service report came out in June 2018. And I'm sure whoever the Department of Energy was involved in this report is probably has an office without a window right now. But it revealed that over 70% of Department of Energy R&D, research and development money, for the entire history of federal research and development, starting after World War II, through till 2008, fiscal year 2008. So 1948 to 2018, 70% went to nuclear power and fossil fuel, 70%. And 50%, nuclear got nearly 50% of R&D. Now that's just R&D, and that's just the Department of Energy. So all the renewables combined, and efficiency, and electric system, grid refurbishment and so forth, all of that got, over that long span of over 7 decades, got about 30% of the federal money. So if you don't think that if there was just a simple diversion of money that's already being spent, going away from fuels, energy that depends on fuels, right? Because all kinds of fossil are fuels. Nuclear is a fuel, it's a uranium fuel. And you take away the fuel issue and you move to a generation that's abundant, that's endless. Again, wind, solar, waves, geothermal, the power of the earth, the heat of the earth, combined with efficiency, combined with smarter buildings. You don't think that we couldn't get a real giant leap into lowering greenhouse gas emissions and into lowering problems with health and to creating jobs that are distributed and that are not dependent on very large, big firms? And one thing I think we have to think of, I know I'm jumping around here, but I want to sort of shuttle in my most things that I think are most important up front. We're thinking of what kind of world do we want to create? Our global economy is being, is going to be to some degree in ashes. Let's acknowledge that. When we are rebuilding and when we're all advocating and talking to friends and talking to family and thinking about it, and frankly, none of us, really has figured all of this out now, because a lot of stuff I think even I've thought about is, oh, I have it all planned. This is the roadmap exactly that we should follow. Well, that roadmap is a little bit distorted now. For instance, maybe we ought to rethink sardine can urban centers where people are living like 2 inches from each other. Even though that's very energy efficient, we may have some problems that we really didn't figure, think through in a globe which is warming, where you're going to have probably more pathogens of many different sorts created, and that's basically a scientific consensus, because we're not just talking about illnesses like COVID and zoonotic illnesses. We're also talking about mosquito-borne illnesses, illnesses from bad water. So we really have to start thinking in terms of our lifestyle, and beyond just the very narrow issue of electricity or even energy. But one of the things I think we might want to consider, which gels very much with essentially the vision that's promoted, and really pretty much as a consensus by most clean energy experts and climate experts from an electric grid point of view, is to go forward towards a distributed, much more heavily renewable grid. So what does that mean? The old grid, which was basically came out of the energies that were available in the 20th century, were based on these huge, big power plants that just pumped out electrons, right? And then that went out almost like envision a wheel. So the hub of the wheel is the power generator, and then the spokes go out and distribute the electrons to all the little people. But the modern grid, again, this is pretty much a consensus, which we're in the process of creating, but need to go a lot faster, is a distributed grid, which means you're getting little bits of energy from generated by a lot of different providers, and the grid operators are much more intensively involved in balancing the flows of energy. One thing people have to be aware of, sometimes we forget, is that electricity, even though it's priced as a commodity, and we tend to mentally think of it as like a thing, it's not, it's a force, right? Electricity is a force, it's electrons, and they flow all over the place, and what the grid operators have to do is manage the flows. And that's a very different thing than simply generating power. So again, going back to renewables and efficiency and changing of the way we build buildings and how we live, maybe we should really just think a lot more about really at this point creating these smaller jobs that aren't dependent on big companies that have a lot of political power and have all the money, and essentially lock communities into the use of their power, because while those are sucking money out of the system, you're not going to be having the funding that's needed to really build the modern grid, to improve efficiency in housing, and to build up new renewable. So a lot of this is really a financial issue, but let me now quickly go into my slide presentation. Maybe Andrew, if you could pull that up. So it, I think, starts on page 5 or slide 5.
No, the fuel cell is first. The fuel cycle, yeah.
Fuel cycle, okay, cool. So this, I don't have to go into this. This is pretty obvious. Nuclear power is actually a chain of very highly intensive industrial processes which combined consume huge amounts of fossil fuel. And by the way, also produce, particularly at the front end stage, a lot of really, really hazardous, dangerous, toxic emissions in the community areas, which are, as many people I'm sure know, out in the United States. Those are located in the American West. They're in New Mexico, and particularly New Mexico and Arizona, on Native American reservations, Navajo particularly. It's really an environmental justice issue. The whole fuel cycle is, but the mining and the milling is particularly a environmental justice issue. And those are communities, by the way, that have borne the brunt of the nuclear fuel cycle of both the civilian and military fuel cycle, because of course out west is where the atomic bomb tests were. And it's still also where you have a lot of pre-processing is planned and so forth. But there's something interesting too. And that is that at the actual generation phase, the active fission actually creates something called carbon-14, C14, which is carbon. And carbon is a greenhouse gas. So the idea that nuclear is zero carbon or no carbon is actually absolutely flat out false. You have the full fuel cycle, which is the only thing that's relevant from a greenhouse gas emission point of view, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But even at the generation phase, you have radioactive carbon. It's radioactive for over 5,000 years. So not only does it stay in not only does it exist as a form of carbon, but throughout, as it's being emitted during the generation of energy, it gets absorbed into living cells, right? All living matter is carbon-based. It goes into humans, it goes into organs, as does many of the other radionuclides. In fact, most of the other radionuclides that are emitted during nuclear power. But what's relevant about the carbon-14, and frankly, I do not think that we have any idea really how much carbon is generated by the full fuel cycle, because it has not been adequately investigated. We do know from the published industry studies that most of it is believed to come out of the stacks during generation of nuclear power, the carbon-14 that doesn't go into the fuel itself, into the spent fuel. And the stacks don't have monitoring. So if the industry was so absolutely certain that it was low carbon, I would really sort of wonder why they haven't given over money. Some of them maybe 7.6 billion that they got from the ratepayers of New York, and given it for a real independent investigation of how much and monitoring of the actual carbon that comes out through the full fuel cycle. The fact that you have an industry that has received hundreds of billions of dollars and they haven't done that is very telling, in my opinion. But
Michelle, we have about 5.
Okay, so let me go to the, I guess the next slide, which is the right. So this is I think, from my perspective, one of the main reasons why we do not want nuclear with a planet that is warming, because it superheats water. It superheats source waters. So the photo, this was an infrared photo. The plume that's coming from the site on the right is the plume from Indian Point. You can see it basically goes the whole way across the Hudson River, and those plumes are generated by every single nuclear power plant into their water source. It's effectively, from a heat point of view, like just basically dropping atomic bombs into waters. And warming waters is a crucial issue with climate change, as is water stress. Also, for those who are familiar with the geography of New York State, Indian Point itself, every single year of its operation, the amount of water it actually sucks in, just pulls in for use in cooling, is the whole volume of water of the river from Troy, New York, all the way down to the tip of Manhattan, which is a just enormous volume of water. And when you're talking about a world where you're going to be having drought conditions and where people are going to be, without any debate, are going to be, especially in areas of the world, that are where heat is becoming a critical issue, out in America, out west, and many other countries. What you're doing is you're creating, through nuclear, a real water crisis of the future that's already started to be here. In other areas, like the New York area, the issues are going to, from a point of view of climate change, are really going to be more extreme weather and flooding, and summer heat waves, when nuclear plants sometimes have to shut down because they either the water that their waterways they're pulling from are dropping too low, or because they're heating up too much, and so that happened actually in France and in Europe, I believe last summer, where they had to shut down a bunch of plants through the European heat wave. So that's one thing. Then the next slide. Okay, so this again goes to the waste issue. Every single minute nuclear power operates, it's generating waste, and that the inventory is getting larger. The industry tells us it's no problem. But again, when we're talking about some things such as environmental justice and human rights, I'm very curious why these sites being considered always seem to be in very low-income minority communities. Really just a coincidence, I'm sure. The New Mexico site that Holtec is now aggressively moving to open, with filing a public comment deadline, by the way, July 22. We'll talk about that at the end of this presentation. Is a very majority Latino, Hispanic area. So the NRC, it's in its environmental impact statement, decided that having the largest nuclear waste dump in the United States would not create much of an impact, because the whole area already has so many New Mexico has so many other kinds of nuclear dumps and sites of all different sorts, and also because it's a major fossil fuel, oil and gas production area. So you already have all these other pollutants and toxins and emissions going into the environment. What's a little bit more? And I'm being a little bit, caustic in my way I'm presenting, but that's essentially that is what they are basically saying. That is what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is saying about putting this huge nuclear waste site on people who are already dealing with so many other issues in our country, and now are deemed exceptionally vulnerable to COVID for a variety of reasons. other attempts of nuclear waste dumps tend to always focus on Native American communities. So for the environmentalists out there who are also usually concerned about environmental justice issues and fairness and equity, I think it's very important you keep these things in mind. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. That was wonderful. A lot of food for thought there. In the interest of time, I think we are going to go to our fourth speaker. And if we have time remaining at the end of Alfred's presentation, we can take a few Q&A. Thank you, Michelle. You covered a lot of ground. Good job.